All right. I'm going to depart from the schedule. Anyone who needs to take a break and go to the restroom, go. But I think it's too important for us to continue, and I have several requests here to continue. I would like to say one thing, and maybe Osama would like to confirm this. There's been some insinuation that Sadat backed away from the Palestinian rights. My strong conviction is that this was one of the most important things that Sadat pushed. And we made extraordinary progress in that. No one here can imagine how difficult it was to get Menachem Begin to agree to accept United Nations Resolution 242 in all its aspects. And that is written in not only in the preamble to the Camp David Accords, but also in the text of the Camp David Accords, which calls for the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories, or the non-acquisition of territory by force. That was an excruciating and very difficult negotiation. The second thing is that Begin himself put forward the idea of full autonomy for the Palestinians. Not just autonomy, but he was the one who insisted on full autonomy. And then in the Camp David Accords themselves, there is a commitment by Menachem Begin to withdraw, specifically, a withdrawal of Israeli armed forces will take place, and there will be a redeployment of the remaining Israeli forces into specified security locations. That's a very clear commitment of the Israelis to proceed with honoring the rights of the Palestinians. Another thing it called for was election of officers of leaders for the Palestinians, which did take place not on schedule, but it took place the first part of the year in 1996. In fact, the Carter Center was in charge of that election, and it was an absolutely honest and fair and open election where the members of the Palestinian Authority were elected, and Yasser Arafat was elected to be president. So all of those things took place, and I would say the most crucial issue of all that would have broken down the entire process was the willingness of Menachem Begin to abandon or dismantle the 14 settlements in the Sinai. This was very difficult for him, and I have always said in any forum in which I've been involved that that was the most courageous and difficult decision made at Camp David. I had no difficult decisions to make. Sadat didn't have very many difficult decisions to make, but that violated a deep commitment and an oath before God that Menachem Begin had made, that he would not dismantle Israeli settlements. And it was the trust that Aharon Barak had from Begin and his exquisite legal capabilities that finally permitted us to come forward with a conclusion that Begin would not authorize the dismantling of those settlements, which was absolutely necessary for Sadat, but that he would permit the Knesset to make that decision. And he further agreed that he would not interfere in the deliberations of the Knesset, and that the Knesset make that decision without his interference. And I think by an 85% margin, the Knesset did indeed approve the dismantling of those settlements in the Sinai region. So one of the main things that we tried to do was to get the Palestinian rights. I do agree with what Big said. That was the worst mistake that the Israelis made, was insisted on continuing with the settlements. When we were there were 25 settlements, and our best estimate was only 5,000 settlers, and they were almost all immediately adjacent to Jerusalem. Since then, other presidents, including Reagan and George Bush Sr., were insistent that the settlements were illegal and an obstacle to peace. Under Presidents Clinton and Bush Jr. Now, the opportunity for the Israelis to build unlimited settlements has been raised. And now there are about 125 settlements. And the New York Times' latest estimate is 235,000 settlers. And this is the single most difficult issue to be faced and the most serious mistake that has been made in my opinion, in the last 25 years. I think rather than, if any of the panelists need to take a break, just do it. But I think I would rather proceed because I have some requests for people to comment. I've already made my brief comment, but
Could I just ask a question on this point?
yeah, please do.
You know, you cited Begin.
Let me say that if any of the panelists want to comment or ask a question, if you'll just turn your thing up like this so I can see it, then I'll call you. I'll call you, then Eli Rubenstein next.
Mr. President, you spoke of Begin being willing to grant full autonomy for the Palestinians. I'd like to raise a question regarding that, and maybe Mr. Barak could also comment. Begin was a stickler for words.
Yeah.
I mean, really very careful and insistent and deliberate about choice of words.
Semanticist.
Yeah, semanticist. As I recall, he did not say full autonomy for the Palestinians because he didn't believe they were Palestinians.
He said Palestinian Arabs.
Palestinian Arabs. That's a very important distinction. He always emphasized that because he didn't accept Palestinian nationalism. Secondly, when he spoke of full autonomy for the Palestinians, he made it clear, at least in private conversations, that it was full autonomy for the people, but not for the people on the land. He had a very subtle distinction here in mind, that it's autonomy for the people in the sense that they would have self-governing instrumentalities, authorities, but it would not involve self-government over land. And that was, again, a very deliberate semantic distinction designed to preclude the idea of homeland for the Palestinians.
Is it all right if I let Aaron respond to that question, Eli, and then call on you?
Yeah.
All right, would you like to? No comment. Okay.
Let me say this. First of all, when you talk about Prime Minister Begin, and again, has been gone for over 10 years, one ought to remember where he came from in terms of his psychological and historical approach. He lost his family in the Holocaust. He was one of the early leaders of clandestine anti-British, the Etzel, the Irgun operations. He was a founding father, one of the founding fathers, and for him, and I'm speaking as a civil servant who was not close to him in any, was not a member of any party or something of the kind, but one has to see where he came from, both historically and ideologically, to understand the compromises that he had to make. When I spoke of loneliness, I meant that he was there, the other members of our delegations, not, except for his own executive assistant, were not, Kadisha, were not members of his political party or his ideology, and he had to cope with his very deep commitment to the idea of what's known as Eretz Israel, or his commitment to the Jewish right over there, and that was something which, for him, to extract language and actions on this was very difficult. But I do know, and I do feel that he would stand by what he promised. Yes, Dr. Brzezinski, it's right that he was talking for Palestinian Arabs at the time, because the feeling was that in the land of Israel and Palestine, the Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs, that was his thinking. And he was, but I want to underline, because many people who spoke about the problem of the settlements, one should remember that I don't think he would have been able to give the okay for more than what he gave. And even President Sadat said that a few days after Camp David, so what's wrong with the 3 months of freeze for the Treaty of Peace with Egypt? One ought to see where he came from. And of course, President Sadat had his own difficulties where he came from. But for Begin, the future of the Jewish people in our country, while trying to be fair to others, to the Palestinians or Palestinian Arabs, as he was referring to the Palestinians, was something very, very deep. Another point is I'd like to mind that there was a myth that was going on, that as if Sinai was promised by Moshe Dayan before the visit of Sadat. I think this is a myth. And it's important to mention that because otherwise we wouldn't have been sitting there negotiating days and nights at Camp David. And I also happened to look through the materials of the time, his meetings with the Egyptian representative, Dr. Touhami, and so on. And it's important to mention that because Camp David was the negotiation. I mean, the real thing was negotiations at Camp David on this. Another point is by the way, Mr. President, you said the first settlement that some administration said was illegal and obstacle to peace. In fact, President Reagan's administration referred to it as not illegal, and then they said, but it was difficult or an obstacle for peace. So I don't want to go into the legality issue, which because of the time, but there were different approaches by American administration. Camp David was a compromise as much as a compromise can be. And unfortunately, and we should say that honestly today, that for many years, the term Camp David for Arabs was not a kosher word. So, for instance, when we negotiated Madrid, I was heavily involved in negotiating Madrid in 1991. The many aspects, and in various other incarnations too, many points from Camp David were taken. Sometimes I would say to Secretary Baker at the time, Camp David is not a fruit salad that you can take only a melon or a whatever, something else. You have to take it as a whole. But they wouldn't refer to Camp David because of the friction in the Arab war that occurred, but they used Camp David a lot thereafter without referring to it that way. Last point here, because there are many things to say. I would refer to the question of that was made by some of the participants on the education for peace. Hal Saunders mentioned that. I didn't have the time to refer to it. That's so very important in our vicinity, and I'm saying that is when we negotiate with Jordan, we try to learn from the lessons of what happened with Egypt. There isn't enough of education. I don't want to criticize. We're here to basically to celebrate an important historic event. I don't want to argue, but there's and it could be said somewhat to our side, I think, to the Arabs, questions of normalizing relations the way they are. These things mean to people because you feel I remember the thrill that Israelis could go to Egypt to tour or something of the kind. But the need to educate for peace is still there. I just read a book by an Egyptian named Tarek Hegi who makes this point. The notion of educating for peace is, and I say it because we have to look for the future, and when people will talk here in the afternoon on the Palestinian issues and others, one has to bear that in mind too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hal Saunders has his folder up first.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I just like to put a little footnote to history here, and in doing so, I have to disagree with two of my colleagues. The meeting at Leeds Castle, I guess at the end of July, the last meeting before Camp David, was termed a failure. And somebody else said something negative about it. I thought it was one of the best meetings we ever had. And it was a best meeting because it was a meeting to talk about what had happened since the Sadat visit to Jerusalem. It was a meeting to take stock. And the best part of it was nobody went there thinking we were going to come out with an agreement. So the talk was free. And therefore, it was wide-ranging. There was a lot of talk about what Israel really needed in the West Bank and so on. So I felt that was very important. And more to the point, several of my colleagues have made the point about careful preparation. The first draft of the Camp David Accords was written at the Churchill Hotel the night we came back to London from Leeds Castle, because we left Leeds Castle thinking we were preparing for a meeting of foreign ministers at the Sinai field positions in the mountains down there, the American surveillance posts. So we came back thinking there was going to be another meeting, and it turned out, for all the reasons that have been discussed today, that President Carter had a more ambitious picture, so it turned out not to be the meeting of foreign ministers, but it turned out to be the meeting at Camp David. the document that I happened to write and shared with some of my colleagues that night in the Churchill Hotel was the document that we amended, developed, Bill and I particularly with Cy Vance, and took to Middleburg that Bill mentioned. It's also a further comment about preparation. We did go to Camp David with a document. We had our own notion in our briefcase of what the Camp David Accords would look like. And at the end of the first week, when things seemed to be slowing down, on Friday afternoon, when the negotiations were going to stop for Shabbat, I sat down and took that document out and thought about what we'd heard through the first week of exchanges and drafted the document that became the negotiating text, which was shared the next morning with my professional colleagues, and we redeveloped it that morning and gave it to President Carter at noon on that Saturday. But that came out of the Leeds Castle talks. And there's further a principle that goes back here, and that was that that was the first time in the peace process when we actually surfaced an American document. We had gone into every one of the Kissinger shuttles with a draft agreement because we wanted to see what the possible compromises were and we wanted to see what the pitfalls were. But we never took that document out of our briefcases during the Kissinger shuttles. It was only at Camp David when Zbig came down to breakfast about 8 o'clock or so and said to the professional team, President Carter wants a draft of an agreement by noon. And so that we brought that document out, which he'd already seen an earlier version of. So let's not knock Leeds Castle, and let's celebrate the preparation that I guess Sam Lewis mentioned as being extremely important.
Osama, maybe you'd like to comment. I hope you will.
I'd like to confirm a point you made accurately. I believe that I felt all along that President Sadat was as committed to the Palestinian cause as he was to the cause of Egypt, because he knew all along that unless we address ourselves fully and adequately to the Palestinian track, nothing would be able to be sustained and continue. And one of his main instructions to us all the time was and has always been that without achieving a meaningful progress on the Palestinian issue, we cannot move. And he was committed to this because of certain theoretical problems in terms of the concepts and so on, conceptual, and also for practical reasons. He knew that unless we get something for the Palestinian people, that means we have not taken the initial step or the first step to solve the Arab-Israeli dispute, because the Arab-Israeli dispute is a coinage that appeared later on. It was basically the Palestinian issue, the dispute between the Palestinians and the Israelis, because prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, we never had any conflict with the Jewish people, we never had any problem called the Arab-Israeli or Arab-Jewish issues and so on. It was the issue of liberating the Palestinian land and enabling the Palestinians to exercise their God-given right to self-determination.
Well, that was, to repeat myself, that was my interpretation, because I know when Sadat arrived at Camp David, even before, he let me and Cy Vance and Zbig know that there were two issues. One was the removal of Israel from the Sinai, and the other one was the preservation or protection of Palestinian rights. And I think we were obviously much more clearly and specifically successful in dealing with the Sinai issue, which has been proven for the last 25 years. The Palestinian issue still hasn't been resolved. I think Sam Lewis.
I'd like to raise another issue about the follow-on. I agree with Hal. I think it's important to emphasize this was a process that started way back in '67, certainly got into high gear in '74, and stayed in high gear through the Carter administration, and then had a bit of a sagging there in the Reagan years, the first part, and then tried to pick up steam again, and it's gone up and down, but it's been a process throughout. And another issue in that process is demonstrated in a way by the success of Camp David and also the failure of the autonomy negotiations. In the Middle East, time is a wasting asset for negotiators. You can have all the stars aligned in the right places, and you think you've got a chance to make a breakthrough, and something totally unanticipated, a vote in the Knesset, an explosion in some capital, a hijacking of an airplane, all sorts of things will suddenly throw you off course. And if you don't move quickly to capitalize on moments of opportunity, they get blown away by unintended events and unanticipated events. We saw that over and over again through the autonomy negotiations period. We saw it again very heavily during the Oslo process. And I've come around to think that one of the great important contributions of the Camp David I process was President Carter drove the process from the minute he took office as hard as he could drive it until we got to the peace treaty. Now, he had to ignore, maybe not ignore, but not to deal with a lot of other problems in the world, and perhaps it cost the administration some other things. But it did produce an outcome. And that was not possible to continue in a way after the signing of the treaty. The President and the Secretary of State both had to spend more time on other issues. They had a good emissary in Saul Linowitz. I don't think Bob Strauss was ideally cut out for it, and he was the first one, but he didn't stay very long. But it wasn't enough to have the emissary. A good emissary can do a lot, but without that daily concentration of the President driving a process to a conclusion as quickly as possible, you're not likely to get there because something is going to blow it out of the water. And that reminds me of the problem of deadlines. We spent about months in the autonomy period struggling with this question of the deadline, which had been finally agreed in the peace treaty negotiations to be 1 year, or a guidelines, or a target date, I think it was finally called. Sy tried to convince the Israelis and the Egyptians, don't have a deadline. He'd done some labor negotiations. He knew the pitfalls. But they insisted. They wanted a deadline, so we had one. The result was both parties felt, we have a whole year to do this, and we don't have to worry too much until we get closer to the deadline. Then the closer they got to the deadline, the more they drew back, thinking, we can't really negotiate and make compromises before a deadline. The deadline itself became an obstacle. And these two elements of time, unintended consequences and the very great dangers in deadlines, are issues of lessons from that period that I think really are quite applicable today as well.
Herman, did you?
Yes. I want to comment very briefly on three things that have been said. One, Hal's point that a document, the U.S. had a document. It seems to me that that was the critical element. Whether or not you table it depends upon the situation as it develops, but you've got a document. There were Egyptian documents and there were Israeli documents. The trouble was the Egyptians were not prepared to accept the Israeli documents and vice versa. Right. At some point, you've got to make a decision, it seems to me, whether you're going to take the risk, and it is a risk, of putting something on the table. Not to impose it, you can't impose it, but to give the parties something to gnaw upon. And let's face it, very often the parties, unable to get together themselves or agree on something themselves, can take what a third party puts on the table and say, they made us do it. Whether we made them do it or not is not the issue, but it's an excuse that you can use if you have to your own publics. To me, that is the missing element at the present time, a document of that sort. This is what we regard as fair and reasonable. Now, gnaw upon it. You may have to change it. Certainly the document that was presented was changed somewhat. But it seems to me that that is the way to go. That's the only way we've ever gotten the kind of things we have gotten, the Camp David agreements, the peace treaty, and it should be followed again. Second, this question of the Palestinians. Certainly, Sadat had deep concern about the Palestinians. But let's face it, the Palestinians were not his prime concern. He was an Egyptian leader. He had Egyptians to worry about, etc. But he did need, if he was going to go ahead in some negotiation, some kind of fellow Arab cover. He could not do it alone without the risk of being told you are deserting the Arab camp. And let's remember, it was Egypt that was the principal Arab state that organized the Arab League and everything else, that headed the Arab League, so some kind of cover was needed. He didn't particularly like Yasser Arafat. It was a contentious issue between the two of them. We're the ones who asked Sadat to negotiate in behalf of the Palestinians. This wasn't a voluntary action on his part. I got instructions to go in to speak to him on this, and when I did, I have to say that the initial response was rather tepid. He knew that Egypt was not authorized or delegated by the Palestinians to speak for them. It was very tepid. He said, I'll want to think about that. Then, curiously, he rather morphed into, I will be the negotiator for the Palestinians. He never said yes, but after about a week or so, he began to talk that this is what we will do. We'll speak for the Palestinian without having any authorization. This was one of the points that worried so many members of his delegation, that there was no Palestinian authorization for Egypt to speak for it. But let's face it, Egypt is Egypt in the Arab world, and Egypt has assumed over the years many responsibilities for other Arab states. Let me stop there, sir.
No, I just want to point out that the President's position was, and was stated in writing, Sadat should not insist on speaking for the West Bank Palestinians.
But you see, where does that leave me getting instructions to ask Sadat to speak for the Palestinians?
Maybe if we gave you contrary conflicting instructions. Or maybe you got yours from Savance.
We asked Gail Barnes to comment on that.
This team wasn't as unified as we thought.
Right.
Of course, when was the date on this?
This was when I was going to Cairo. This was after Camp David in pursuit of the peace process.
That's right. And as a matter of fact, the emphasis had changed from then. We were focusing for the 6 months after Camp David on getting the peace treaty negotiated in detail between Israel and Egypt. While we were at Camp David, I had written down on a scratch pad the basic elements of the withdrawal from the Sinai, what to do about the 3 airfields there, how close to the Israeli border any Egyptians could come, how far particular kinds of artillery and tanks could move across the Suez Canal, those kinds of things. And we thought, I thought, when we left Camp David, that the 3-month period that we had decided upon would be a gracious plenty. But we soon found that there was some backing off, in my opinion, on the part of the Prime Minister. Moshe Dayan, when he talked to me, felt that his authority had been dramatically reduced, even though he was sent to Washington to negotiate. He felt that he didn't have the authority to make any concession at all, that any concession he made had to be approved back in Jerusalem. And so at the time Big went to talk to Sadat, it was not in Sadat's or anyone else's interest for him to project himself forward as a primary spokesperson for the Palestinians, but to deal with the very difficult and intricate questions that related only to Egypt and Israel. So there was a different emphasis as we concluded the peace treaty than there was 6 months earlier when we concluded at Camp David, when the Palestinians issue was I think, very high on the priority list. Osama, do you have any comment to make about that?
I quite agree with you, Mr. President. The President Sadat wanted to, he was caught in between two different extremes. One extreme would say that he should go into the process of Camp David, knowing exactly what he can get, and guaranteeing that he will not be forced to make any concessions that he would think were not tenable, and that might lead to further litigation in the future, rather than animosity, and rather than conciliation and coexistence. On the other hand, he knew that he did not have a mandate by the Palestinians, so he cannot speak on their behalf fully. He can express their aspirations, their own the views that are known to be representing the Palestinian cause, but without any specificity. And specificity is needed when you get into the stage of writing down something that can be binding, that can bind future generations of both sides. So for this reason, I believe that President Sadat was making it a point that he will never abandon any Palestinian right, that he will never betray the Palestinians or commit them to a certain position they wouldn't like to commit themselves to, both for ethical and for practical purposes. But I'd like to terminate my remarks by repeating again that had it not been for your dedication and your willingness to devote your time and effort continuously to this awesome responsibility, wouldn't have been able to get anywhere.
Thank you for that. One of the things that's interesting is the extreme peer pressure that exists within the Arab world. We have the ambassador from Egypt here now, but one of the things that was impressive to me at the time was even before we went and had the peace treaty consummated, the Saudis privately, including King Fahd personally, he was in the not king, but he was speaking for the king, was greatly supportive of the peace process, and stopped in Washington on the way back from hospital to give us full approval for what we were doing. Whereas publicly, the Saudi Arabians were condemnatory of what Sadat had done. Even when I went to Jerusalem and to Cairo the following spring, finally to conclude the details of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, the first phone call I got back when I got in Air Force One and took off from the airport in Cairo was from the Saudis, saying they were fully supportive of what we had done. But even then, they led the attack on Sadat and boycotted Sadat, and the Arab League moved out of Cairo and so forth. So privately, the Saudis were supportive, but publicly and in the realm of the Arab League, they were condemning what Sadat had done in making concessions and working out a treaty with Israel.
But if you permit me, Mr. President, I don't think that Saudi Arabia led the opposition to what President Sadat achieved or was doing. It was President Saddam Hussein of Iraq then,
Yes.
who made that thing. No, honestly, because it was the Saudi government was not sure that the process is going to work, but they knew, on the other hand, that something has to be done, and that with your involvement and with your commitment, at the end of the road, we might reach an honorable agreement. But they did not. They were not sure that they could take the heat and or associate themselves with something they have not been party to.
I think I misspoke when I said they led the fight. I didn't mean that exactly. Was it your impression, Osama, that during that time that the Saudis were giving private support or encouragement to Sadat?
they were not being, they did not give him the impression that they were opposed to what he was doing.
Yes.
But they were telling him that for them to be able to approve of something or support him, there must be something that will meet the minimum requirements of the Palestinians. And in the absence of that, they will be exposing themselves to certain undue pressure and accusations by this or that, sir.
Harold, was it you who went over to? Yes, sir. I thought you. Yes. Harold went over, and Hussein had given me after Camp David a voluminous list of questions, about 25 different questions, which I hand wrote the answers to, and then Hal Saunders went over to converse with King Hussein, hoping and expecting that he might publicly support the Camp David Accords, which would have been a major step forward. And I think history would have been different had he done so. Why don't you describe just briefly what occurred there?
Hussein, I think, was supportive of the concept, but he didn't think we could deliver. I mean, that was his bottom line. He became very emotional. His wife had been killed in the helicopter, and it was the same helicopter that had taken him, King Hussein, to the secret meetings with Israelis. So somehow in his mind, all that emotion got bound up in that, and he said, "Look, Hal, you know, I would give my life if I could bring peace to my people. But I'm just afraid that you can't make this work." So it was a pragmatic decision, and of course, what we were really asking him and Fahad during that trip of mine was to try to postpone the Arab Summit meeting, which as Osama said, the Iraqis were pressing for. And neither Hussein nor Fahad seemed to feel able to buck that. And I even think we had some intelligence reports at the time that there had been assassination threats to the Saudi leadership emanating from Iraq. So there was a lot going on there. But
Mr. President, on King Hussein, this brings in the question of ripeness. I had many conversations with King Hussein in later years, in the years of making peace with Jordan. So, in those years, he had been determined to move ahead, and finally he did move, and we had the Treaty of Peace made with Jordan, which was a very important milestone. I think that looking back, he didn't feel ripe, and ripeness is an important issue. It was mentioned before here by some of our colleagues. We live in a complicated part of the world, and without, God forbid, being offensive, but you do have this notion that was mentioned about some of the parties or players that in private meetings they would say many things that would be in the right direction in terms of peace, but the test would be, can they go public? Can they afford going public? With the pressures that exist, Dr. Al-Baz mentioned it, some of the Americans mentioned it. It's we as we look historically, we can argue that this or that side could have moved earlier, but I think that there's the question of ripeness, and of course you can ask when is something ripe, who decides what is ripe. But at the end of the day, this is the party who has to deliver, has to decide that it is ripe. Sometimes you think something is ripe and it's not. In the afternoon, you'll be talking the Palestinian issues. There's a lot of disappointment because people thought things were ripe and they were not probably ripe, and tragedies occur. So what I'm trying to say is that when you look at things historically, you can criticize or argue this or that on that side, on say something on us, say something on Arabs, but the question is whether a particular side, and what happened at Camp David was that God brought to the same roof, under the same roof, people who, with all their problems and differences, felt at that point of history that they ought to make the decision despite the difficulties. And I remember the problems. I remember even Dr. Boutros Ghali saying to us in the Treaty of Peace negotiation in the beginning, let's finish it until this or that date, because there's this Baghdad conference coming maybe November 1 or something, and we should be there before, and so on. So the message of complexity has to be in our mind when we make judgment on historical points.
Very good. Do we have the tape from Boutros Ghali? Anybody know? It didn't, not ready yet, but it might come in later. Okay, that's fine. Jack Nelson, you had done over, I have a question.
Mr. President, I'd like to ask you a question.
Me? I'll get mine.
At one point, Joey Powell called David Broder, both and myself, over to have lunch with you, and we spent about an hour.
Do we have a mic? I know everybody like to hear the question, and I can't quite hear you.
At one point, Jody Powell called David Broder of the Post and myself over to have lunch with you in the Rose Garden. And it was an hour off-the-record session. And it was all about the Mideast. And when we left, we looked at each other and said, well, we know what that was about. And what it was about was you're assuring us, I guess so we would assure our readers, that you were supportive of Israel. Now, I wondered, why is it that you have had such a hard time sometimes of convincing Israel that you are really supportive of them? Even when you were pulling off the Camp David Accords, you were under criticism at some time by Israeli leaders. Was part of it because you were so close to Sadat, or is there some other reason?
Well, I think I mentioned in my opening remarks that I had been in office just 2 months. I went up to Massachusetts and made a speech calling for a Palestinian homeland, which seems innocuous now. But at that time, it was unprecedented. And it was on that basis of trying to protect Palestinian rights and honor the principles expressed in United Nations Resolution 242 and 338 and so forth, with which everybody is familiar, which is primarily three things in the substance. Israel withdrawing from the occupied territories, a universal recognition of Israel's right to exist and exist in peace, and to treat the Palestinian refugees with justice. Those are the three things in UN Resolution 242, and I maintain an allegiance to them. I was really the first Democratic president that ever lost the strong support of the Jewish community in this country. But at the time of Camp David, when we came out of Camp David and signed the agreement in the White House, and then 6 months later with the treaty, we had an enormous and beautiful celebration with a big tent, and everybody seemed to be euphoric. I had, I think, strong support from the Jewish community in this country. But I have maintained ever since then a feeling that there needs to be a balance between Israel and the Palestinians. And that's not an acceptable position for many American politicians. I'm not an American politician anymore. And maybe one of the reasons I'm not an American politician anymore is because I took a balanced position. But still, I think that's the proper way to go now. And so I have always felt that I was a strong supporter of Israel. And when I call now for Israel's withdrawal from the massive settlement policy, I'm not trying to work to the destruction of Israel. In my personal opinion, that's the best thing for the Israelis. And I don't have any authority. I just have my voice. But I have noticed recently, even in the New York Times, which I don't think is biased against Israel, there is a question now being raised repeatedly. What is the distant future of Israel? Is it to maintain control over the West Bank and Gaza with the severe restriction on Palestinians' movements and basic freedoms, or is it to eliminate the 67 so-called Green Line and have one land body west of the Jordan River that's going to be a homogeneous mixture of Jews and non-Jews, where the majority of non-Jews within the next 10 years or so is going to be able to prevail politically. Will they be given a right to vote, or will they be deprived of a right to vote? So those questions have still not yet been answered. And my own personal opinion has been 25 years ago and still is that it's better to honor the UN resolutions 242 and for Israel basically to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. There's some caveats to that in which I believe very deeply, and that is that there's no way that Israel can or should withdraw to the 1967 borders or to the so-called Green Line. There has to be some modifications. And a major portion of the Jewish settlers, in my opinion, will be there permanently. Those in the proximity of Jerusalem and a few other places that I could draw on them out. But the extensive implanting of Jewish settlements, maybe 10 or 12 here and 10 or 12 there, or 25 there, with a company or a regiment of Israeli troops to protect them, and then highways to connect them that are basically protected, I think is counterproductive. So that's a decision that still hasn't been made. And I certainly don't have any authority. I have zero influence anymore as far as what is going to be done. But I'm very concerned about that, and that's why I have been characterized perhaps as not being friendly enough or protective enough of Israel. Another point to be made, I was going to make this and some comments at noon, the basic strategic situation has changed. And this is a subject that I've never seen addressed before. When I was president, it was in the midst of the Cold War. And what happened with Egypt, what happened with Syria, what happened with other Arab nations, what happened with the Palestinians was uncertain. Sadat had just recently thrown out the Russians. And when I had a confrontation with Sadat at Camp David, I told him that this might very well be the dividing line between the United States and Egypt. But there was a great strategic issue involved about my own country's security and stability, because we were inseparable then from what happened in the Mideast. If it had erupted in a war, it would not have been just throwing stones or helicopter attacks or tank attacks in Hebron or in the Gaza Strip. It would have been a conflagration that could have been uncontrollable. As a matter of fact, at the end of the 73 war was the only time in history that there was a marshaling, an alert of nuclear forces from the Soviet Union and the United States. So in the midst of the Cold War, to summarize, we had major strategic interest in what happened in Israel and with Israel's neighbors. That is no longer the case, which is a harsh realization. In many ways, the United States could back away from Israel and the Palestinian issue now, without any serious threat to our own security or involvement. It's our allegiance to Israel, including mine and all of my predecessors and successors, that has bound us to Israel. But we were directly involved then. We're not any more involved now. And that's one reason why President Bush could go through his entire term in office, 4 years only, and not become deeply involved in the Mideast peace process. I hope he will, but I'm not sure that that's likely. So there's a difference in situation now, but I have always been loyal to Israel. I have never wavered in military, political, or economic support for Israel, and in my opinion, everything that we did at Camp David and subsequently has been designed to preserve the integrity of Israel.
Has President Bush at all solicited your advice?
No.
If I could ask mine,
Yeah, please.
the first place I found this morning absolutely fascinating as a sometime historian to hear the retrospective thoughts of you all. I have a question, but first I want to make one little parenthetical remark. Hearing about the commitment that is necessary, President Carter and I have both been somewhat involved with the North Korean problem. There was a meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago in Beijing of the United States and the North Koreans in the six-party context, which is probably a good idea. But the meeting took 30 minutes, including consecutive translation. And the instructions to the American chief of delegation was no negotiation. You can have a contact, but no negotiation. It's clear that's a totally different thing from the kind of commitment that you all have been talking about this morning. Now to the question. The question is, things that we've heard about today, particularly the problems, the things that slipped, the mistakes and so on that have been cited, and of course there are always in any historical things that develop later. I think of the ones that were mentioned first by Bill Quant, the failure to do anything about the settlements. Secondly, Sam Lewis is saying that you have to rely on powerful political leaders, and of course some of them were lost, Sadat, Begin, and then later on Rabin, whose loss was so grievous. The third thing, the failure to involve the Palestinians, which Sam Lewis brought up, and Hal's statement of the failure to really convince the publics sufficiently. Could you have, do any of you think you did foresee, or could you have foreseen these difficulties coming? And if you had, in practical terms, could you have done anything about it, which would have headed off some of these difficulties, given the fact that, of course, the Carter administration ended up having 4 years, not a longer period of time? Could it have been different had you seen this future, and was there a chance to do something that would have alleviated some of these things?
I'd like for others to join in, but in my opinion, we went as far as was humanly possible at Camp David. I don't think we could have got another word of concession from either the Egyptians or the Israelis. In fact, the whole process was on the verge of total collapse. I had asked Bill Quant to draft a failure statement to be issued. And this was just a few hours before we finally adjourned. And as I mentioned before, that last final subtle change to let the Knesset decide on dismantling Yamit and other 13 little settlements was almost a straw that broke the camel back, and it was that gave us success instead of complete failure. And had we failed at that point, a treaty between Israel and Egypt would have been out of the question. We would never have considered it anymore. I would like for others to comment if we could have gone any further with it.
I think on the Egyptian-Israeli front, we did the best we could, and I think the test has been that it's lasted for 25 years. I do think there is the issue that I mentioned, and I wasn't present for the discussion of how to handle the issue of a period of settlement freeze for the West Bank, but my understanding is that we asked for a settlement freeze that would last through the period
when the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the autonomy negotiations, which was not a 3-month period. It ended up being more like a 1-year period. And Begin offered 3 months by tying it to the Egyptian-Israeli negotiations. I think, and I have to speculate on this, but the way we formulated the request was that it should remain, the resettlement should remain frozen, settlement activity should remain frozen until the autonomy negotiations had been concluded. To Begin meant that could be indefinitely because the negotiations might not succeed. And I thought that later that maybe we should have asked for a 1-year freeze, because Begin could probably do that. If he could do 3 months, he could agree to a year. What he couldn't agree was that it would go on forever, possibly, if the negotiations failed. And would it have made a difference? I think what it would have meant is that we didn't have the day after Camp David the perception that on the first test of interpretation of what had been agreed upon, we said Israel had agreed to a freeze on settlements for the duration of the autonomy negotiations. Begin immediately came out and said, no, I didn't. And we had nothing on paper to point to. And so on the first test of interpretation, Begin won. And I think that helped discourage King Hussein. I think it helped to set the tone of what's going to happen whenever there's an argument over what was agreed upon. First, there's no document, there's nothing in writing about this settlement freeze. That was a gap. And when it came down to interpreting what it meant, Begin said, I agreed to 3 months, period, that's it. If we could have got him to say a year and said that the autonomy negotiations had a year to go, at least the facts on the ground would not have been changing as we were inviting Jordanians, Palestinians, and other Arabs to join the Camp David process. It's the only thing I can think of that we might have done differently, and we might have actually succeeded in getting Begin to say yes to.
Well, there I disagree with Hal, because I was present. Sure. And my strong belief and my written notes say that Begin agreed to freeze the settlements during the autonomy talks. And the schedule for the autonomy talks was very clearly expressed. And Cy Vance agreed with me. But it was just a few days after that that Begin then announced, in my opinion, contrary to what he had said, but he's an honest man, and this was the only difference that he and I had in this way, which I think is minimal for all the complex things. He said only 3 months. 3 months was not long enough. It took us 6 months just to get the peace treaty negotiated. So that was a very serious defect in not having that in writing. Whether we could have gotten in writing what I thought he told me verbally is another question. That is a possibility. I agree with Bill on that subject.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Could I follow on that just a minute?
Yes, you can.
Because it was that morning that Begin sent the letter saying 3 months. Right, Hal brought you the letter the morning after that meeting. And my question has always been,
I think it was Bill,
The morning of the 17th.
yeah, morning of the 17th.
5 years ago, just right now.
The morning,
Monday or?
no,
Was this
morning
Sunday
of
morning.
the signing, as I understand it. Because then the question was, you'd already seen Sadat that morning and mentioned you had this commitment, as I understand it. Now, you then get the letter, says 3 months, and you give it back, I think, to Hal and say, look, Hal, this isn't the right thing. Go back and please get the right letter. And you never spoke to Begin about it that day. And Hal, of course, couldn't get another letter. My question to myself has always been, if you had risked a blow-up over that morning, if you'd gone to Begin yourself and said, there's a misunderstanding, this isn't what you said last night, can't you give me a year, or let's make it more specific, or please give me the right letter, or talk it out with him, do you think that would have blown up the treaty? That's my question.
I don't think anybody could know.
What do the Israelis think? Maybe they would. Ellie, do you think that would have
Oh,
blown it up?
maybe Aaron was more into the core meetings, but my impression was that it was the maximum misunderstanding. Begin was a man of his word. If he, and you said yourself, Mr. President, was an honest man, I don't think that he would have given a commitment which was be into the core problems of his ideological beliefs and convictions. I think that, in fact, President Sadat said a few days later in Congress, I believe, well, so what's wrong about 3 months? I don't think Begin would have gone on his word. I've seen him again. I wasn't personally part of his close entourage, but I saw over the years he was a man of his word. So my belief was that this was a misunderstanding rather than a going back on something that he said. And again, maybe Aaron would know more, but at the time we were probing into the documents and what we saw, and that was, and our feeling was clearly that this had indeed been a misunderstanding.
I agree, it was a misunderstanding. I don't believe that Begin lied to me about it. I think that he meant when he said it that it was 3 months. I thought when he said it, it was during the negotiations, and of course I had no way to enforce anything because it was Prime Minister Begin's decision to make, not mine, about how long the settlements would be frozen. The thing to remember, though, is the difference between then, with 25 little tiny settlements,
Yeah,
a total population of 6,000,
right.
and now settlements everywhere with 235,000, that has been the enormous change in the last 25 years. Sam, did you have another comment?
Well, that's the point. There was no question that was a crucial moment.
It was.
And we've all paid the price because nobody since has tried as hard as you did. But I still wonder if you couldn't have talked him into it that morning, if you'd done it personally.
Nobody knows. Harold, do you have?
Well, just a fact. I participated in this talk. There was the President of the United States, there was Begin, and I think Vance
Diane
also.
was there.
Vance?
Diane wasn't there.
No?
To the best of my,
Maybe
but
she
I don't remember.
Yes, he was.
The only one who took notes was myself.
Yeah, we got to get it settled.
And I have my notes. And I took my notes and put them somewhere else. And then, because I didn't care about it. And then when this dispute came up, Begin called me up and said, Awan, you wrote down, what have you written? I opened my notes, 3 months. And I also, I told the President, the Prime Minister, look, if you want, I will make a Xerox of my handwriting and I'll send it to President Carter. And I called President Carter. And I told him, 3 months, this is what I wrote down. So those are the facts as I have seen them.
The only other
I don't dispute that.
written record is I was sitting outside, and Secretary Vance came out and debriefed us, and he said, we know we have a 3-month commitment from Begin. It might be longer. We need to pin it down tomorrow. That's what my notes say. It might be longer.
There's another factor in that we didn't anticipate the discussions were going to go on indefinitely and still be pending 25 years later about Israeli settlements. We thought that we were heading toward a complete agreement in the time schedule specified in the Camp David document, which is available to all of you. Anyone else? Yeah, Jody?
A brief thought here, as someone who has no notes, and if I had, they would have long been destroyed. But it seems to me, and I offer this as an observation, that as we sort of go through the Who Shot Johns and the TikToks on this, that we might, on occasion, being in danger of sort of missing the real issue or the real problem. As a layman, it seems to me that to the extent, which I think a lot of people do, we see the settlements and their expansion as a huge problem now. You know, it was not what happened between in those 9 months between the 3 month and the 12 months that has created the problem.
Yeah, that's right.
What has created the problem is what has happened in the many years after that. And I will offer an observation, which people may be free to challenge, and despite President Carter's observation, he had no control over this, that if President Carter had been president for another 4 years, that at least during those 4 years, the expansion would not have taken place.
think that's a good point. Very good.
I've got a summary here that I copied out of the New York Times a couple of days ago of a number of settlers and settlements. And for a couple of years after that, there was no substantial increase. The massive increase has taken place in the last 12 years. But that's a moot point now, but it's a very interesting thing to pursue because the proof of history has been that the number and extent of Israeli settlements has become the single obstacle, in my opinion, to resolving the issue in the Mideast.
Mr. President, I don't want to go into current politics, but the focus has been here on settlements, and this is one of the issues that had to be settled. And I said before I attended Camp David 2000, and there were ideas which you also mentioned, part of them in one of your remarks here, on how to resolve this issue. But I just took now the floor for one reason, because the focus has been on the settlements as if this is the question. It is a question, but there are other questions, and I assumed in the afternoon people here will be talking about terror, about commitment, about leadership, about tragedies. Camp David 2000 could have been different. The years after that could have been. We all of us speak of iffy matters in history. If you tried to Begin this, if this would have happened. The iffy issues are, I think I will, despite my initial inclination, take the floor for a few minutes in the afternoon just to speak of what's happening now, because we should see the picture in its entirety, and there is an address to the issues, and the address is the lack of a partner and not the focus on one issue, which is worth looking at and resolving, but it's not the issue. And the issue is, you said, Mr. President, at Camp David, and Mr. Begin was very proud of it, that the security of Israel will be maintained during the agreements and forever and so on. And you mentioned today your commitment. Yes. The issue of security, which is so, I don't want to mince words, but going to the funeral, I know the doctor that was killed last week with his daughter the night before her wedding. He was a neighbor. I went to the funeral. I rarely weep. I was weeping all the time. And for what reason? So I'm saying that we should look at the entire picture. It's true that after Camp David, this was an issue that was dealt with on a daily basis for a few weeks or for a few months, and may have been of importance. This is not the whole picture. I must say that. Thank you.
Yes, please.
I want to fill you in a little bit historically about what happened.
How about getting a mic, please?
As you know, Mr. President, I was pretty close with Ezer Weitzman and you during this process. Sam Lewis was absolutely correct when he said that Menachem Begin had buyer's remorse. Begin was a man of his word, as Eliakim says, but Ezer Weitzman resigned, basically because he thought that you were correct. And at the point he did resign, he was the crown prince of the Likud party and well on his way to think he could be the next prime minister. But the facts on the ground showed that he could not beat Menachem Begin at that point. So I think that you are totally correct that the people of Israel at that point were exhausted to its limitation. And that was tested because Ezer was very angry at Begin at that point. He was really upset. He kept saying to me, Leon, this guy really is sorry what he did, but he'll stand by what he did. And I don't know, but you look up the documents then, Weitzman was the most popular guy in the country at that point and really on his way to becoming a prime minister. And he really thought he could knock him off, and he thought that he'd be going and become the next prime minister. And before he resigned, I went to see Brzezinski in his office, and I talked to Harold Brown, and then you called Weitzman at his home and talked a little bit about it. But I think that historically speaking, you could not go any further because the people of Israel at that point just couldn't take it.
Thank you, Leon.
Begin.
Any other comments or questions before we,
Back there.
yeah. Yes, right here. It's hard for me to see with the lights. On the second row here, anybody have a mic? Got mics coming from every direction.
Thanks, Mr. President. The joke in your staff was that if they wanted to get you to do something, they should tell you it's politically costly. And I know that, this issue, we've been touching on it, but I want to go back to Hamilton Jordan. He underplayed his role in all of this. But I recall that from the record that he had prepared an extraordinary document for you personally, for your eyes only, very early, asking you to focus on building a domestic constituency for any major initiative, especially on the Middle East, including building a coalition among senators, members of Congress, community, particularly the Jewish community. And that, my recollection is that you, in fact, did begin do that. And my question to you is, do you feel that you've done enough of that? And had you not done it, would you have succeeded here at home? And is this sort of part of any successful American diplomacy today, particularly toward the Middle East, that you can't succeed unless you have a huge domestic coalition to move forward?
Well, back in those days, we had, I think, senatorial giants, including Jacob Javits and Abe Ribicoff, who in a way could speak to me as the president on behalf of the Jewish community. And they were supportive. And if you go back to the two major occasions, one at the conclusion of the Camp David Accords, which is, everybody knows, 25 years ago today, and 6 months later when we signed the peace treaty, I felt then, as a sensitive political figure, that there was a massive approbation of what we did, both within the general public and also within the American Jewish community. And I don't have any reason to have changed my mind about that. But as time goes on and the bloodshed occurs and the dissension arises again, there is an innate sense of protection of Israel that arises in this country. And it's part of not the American Jewish community, but the American community in general. And that's the way I think it ought to be, and that's the way it's going to be. So there's never been any balance in the American community between the Jewish community, that is Israel on the one hand, and any adversary. There was a semblance of balance because of Sadat's personality and because he went to Jerusalem and he made a speech to the Knesset. There was a semblance of a balance then between Israel on the one hand and Egypt on the other hand, personified by Sadat. That was a transient circumstance. So the overwhelming feeling in this country now and then and in the future is when Israel's in trouble, Israel will have our support. Yes.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion with so many colleagues that we admire. First, thank you also for sticking to your position about settlements, because clearly as you travel to the region, as I have for the last couple of decades.
Did you let folks know who you are? And who,
Judith Kipper, Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you.
The settlements issue has, from the day after 242 was adopted, has always been the symbol of Israel's ultimate intentions about the land. And finally, the issue between Israel and the Palestinians is about the land. I want to ask you if you think that presidential power has changed since the end of the Cold War, when we live in a world of transnational threats. Today, if a president calls in the leadership of the Congress, the Christian right, the Jewish community, the Arab American community, and says, this is our policy, this is what we're going to do, you're with me or you're against me, has that possibility with the end of the Cold War and the strategic threat that you spoke about, has that been diluted, or you think it can still be done?
Well, I might let Jody or Hamilton or Big respond to that more than I, but there are times in our country when the president speaks with almost absolute authority and with overwhelming support. I think the most vivid example of that has been after 9/11, when President Bush had almost an open door to instituting almost any plan that he and his advisors evolved under the guise or umbrella or name of terrorism and protection against terrorism, because our whole country felt that President Bush was correct when he said we are at war with terrorists and we're on the same footing, in effect, as we were after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So in a period of crisis, when the president changes from being a belabored civilian administrator into the commander-in-chief of our military forces, that's when the president does have that overwhelming presumption of authority and influence. But in the between times, I think the president has got to struggle for every possible element of political support from various groups. Sometimes they are in conflict with each other in order to prevail. I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but that's the way I see it. And the more the crisis is involving our nation's security, the more dominant the president is, because he becomes the commander-in-chief. In between times, he's got to struggle for every possible realm of support.
I just wanted to make one point. The Camp David agreements, the accords, the accomplishment was very well and strongly received by the American people. I don't remember the particular polls, but in those days, the vice president used to go out among the people. And I traveled the whole country, and there was a lot of excitement and pride in that.
Mr. President? Yeah, I can't say. Sam?
No, it's
Yes,
George.
I had. I think you made a good point. I think the Cold War provided a context to rally kind of disparate groups behind things that were perceived as national interest. Things were black and white. There was always the Soviet bogeyman that you could that was there. And here we are today. Things are not black and white. They're all shades of gray. And our country is seen around the world, admired in many ways, and hated in others, and the only real superpower, economically dominant. And so I think it makes building and organizing, diffuse domestic constituencies for these controversial issues much more difficult. So I think your point is valid, and I think our political system, just by its nature and evolution, is much more fragmented, highly partisan, and dominated in both parties by extreme voices.
Yeah, can I add to that, Mr. President?
Jody?
Yeah, I want to follow on Hamilton's last comment, and I want to try to be careful about how I say this. But in this world today, which is so much more partisan and nasty and divided than it was 20, 25 years ago, and I thought things were tough enough then on many days. And you have a situation like what happened on 9/11, or those moments of tragedy or challenge that sort of bring a country together. There is a very important choice that has to be made. Inevitably, there will be, whatever the choice, there will be that rallying behind. Then there's a judgment that has to be made as to whether one will use that as an opportunity to reach out and try to build a genuine bipartisan coalition in support of a particular approach, or to what extent that will be used also as an attempt to gain political advantage. And I think it follows as the night today that to the extent the former is the course taken, the more longer lasting and the more powerful, the more beneficial to the country that rallying together will be. To the extent the latter is the choice, the more fragile and the shorter term and the less able to withstand difficulties down the road, that support will be.
Let me just add one more point to this. It seems to me that, of course, the president has an enormous opportunity to mobilize public support on behalf of a policy that he favors, and he does so particularly when there is a crisis. But there is a danger in this, namely, how does he define the crisis? Is the definition of the crisis a real definition of the challenge, or is it something that has a peculiar lifespan to it, in that the crisis is so vaguely defined that it can be viewed almost as permanent? If you define the crisis on the basis of fear, you can mobilize public support, but there are costs to that, because fear also breeds attitudes and hatreds and intolerance that can be dangerous. And I think we have to be very conscious of that today. Secondly, when you mobilize public support, you have to be, particularly in a democracy where leadership is dependent on support, completely truthful. You do not want to mobilize public support on the basis of allegations, assertions that over time become increasingly doubtful as to their factual correctness, because credibility between the leader and followers and credibility of America in the world is a very precious asset. When we were struggling for peace in the Middle East, it was a good cause. The crisis was tangible. What was being sought was very specific, a peace agreement. We didn't accomplish everything we wanted, but it was concrete. Much the same was the case with the Cold War. What worries me a great deal about the contemporary circumstances is that the danger is vague. It is being propounded on the basis of fear. If there are no acts of terrorism, that means we're winning the phantom war against terrorism. If there are acts of terrorism, that means there is a war on terrorism. And the evidence is occasionally subject to doubt. And that, I think, is very pernicious for the longer-term functioning of a democracy.
Yes.
Mr. President,
Yes, sir.
Ted Katouf, until recently I was the U.S. ambassador to Syria.
All right, good.
And I wanted to ask you, when you first came into office, and I was a junior diplomat then in Damascus, as I recall, it was your hope to put together a conference on the Middle East to try to settle the issue comprehensively. Assad was a very tough customer. He had his requirements. It seems to me President Sadat did not want to mortgage Egypt's foreign policy to the lowest common denominator, and he, largely on his own, decided to try to move ahead separately and apart from any conference that would shackle his ability to maneuver. Could you comment, or could you have one of your former aides comment on how that, on the extent to which you saw that coming, you were briefed on it, part of it, or did it come as a bit of a surprise to American policymakers as well?
Well, as far as as Assad was concerned, when I first became president, Big and I effectively made out a list of about 10 major accomplishments we wanted to address. Mideast peace was just one of them. It was a very important one. And Assad was a crucial player because at that time we were laboring under a United Nations resolution that called for an international conference to be headed by the United States and the Soviet Union. We had a brief skirmish with that the 1st of October 1977. But I wanted to meet with Assad to see what his degree of flexibility was. And he wouldn't come to the United States and never did. even though I invited him then and I invited him later as a former president. And I went to Syria several times after I left the White House to meet with him, writing a book about the Mideast and other reasons. I actually met with him in Geneva when I was involved in the summit conference of the G7 in June of 1977. I went to Great Britain for the summit conference. I went there a little early, and I took a side trip to Geneva and met Assad. He made it plain then that he would not be flexible, but he was affable, and we got along fairly well. But when Sadat moved to the forefront, there seemed to me to be an anti-Sadat factor in Assad's attitude. He deeply resented any insinuation by Sadat that he was speaking for the Arab world. And Assad kept that attitude until the last time I saw him, which was not very long before he died. So Sadat turned out to be the most accommodating and flexible and dependable ally that I had. And so I by default, we placed our eggs in the Sadat-Begin basket after Begin was surprisingly elected, I think in May of 1977. We actually invited and hoped that Hussein might join us. That proved to be impossible. I was willing for the PLO to join us, but there was a prerequisite, which they never came close to fulfilling, that they had to accept United Nations Resolution 242 and acknowledge Israel's right to exist and exist in peace. They wouldn't do that. So a lot of people have asked me, even recently, with this anniversary coming up, don't I think I would have been better off if we had had the Palestinians and Jordanians at Camp David? I don't think we would have accomplished anything. And it was legally and politically prohibitive for the PLO to come. And it was not possible for Hussein to take that chance.
May I add a footnote?
Yeah, please do.
Moshe Dayan met with the Egyptian representative, Dr. Tuhami, a few times. One of them was a couple of weeks after the Sadat visit to Israel. That was in Morocco. I attended that meeting. And Dayan wrote in Hebrew a kind of an outline of what he had in mind as we were now starting a new page with Egypt, Palestinians, and he had also a few lines on Syria, on the Golan Heights and so on. And I translated it into English, and we worked on it and so on, and finally we gave it to Dr. Tuhami, and he read through the paper, and when he got to the Syrian lines, he just folded the paper, tore the few lines that were connected with Syria, gave it back to Dayan and said, not dealing with that. And he gave it back to him. And I should have kept this. I think I didn't. But, so in a way, it somehow complements what he just said as the president. And unfortunately, we did have talks with Syria. Being archaeological artifacts, I attended them also in Shepherdstown a few years ago here in West Virginia, and they didn't take off, unfortunately. And again, I have respect for everybody, but they even couldn't bring themselves to shake our hands in those talks, the basic, saying hello. And the gap shrunk, but it couldn't be overcome. So we're still there. But at the time, there was, Dayan raised it because he thought, as we talk, the whole 242 gambit, we'll talk about that too, but that was what happened. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rubenstein was ubiquitous. He seemed at every meeting he seemed to have been there, and that was great.
Not in every,
well,
some of this.
Yeah, a lot. But this is very enlightening. We're gonna run out of time soon, but I'll call on Hal before we. And then, okay.
Just a word on the Assad part of this picture. You may recall that we resumed relations with Syria and became intensively involved in the mediation of the Israeli-Syrian disengagement agreement with Kissinger in May 1975. Having achieved that agreement and then moved in to the latter part of the year, the question was, well, what was going to be the next effort? We had an Egyptian-Israeli disengagement, a Syrian-Israeli, and then the hope was to do something on the Jordanian front, but that became not possible because of the Rabat decision and so on. So the question was open at the beginning of the Ford administration, what next? And I remember our talking to Syria, to Assad, at a point when we'd pretty much decided that there would be a second Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreement, which came to being a Sinai II. But when Kissinger talked to Assad about that, Assad was plainly quite opposed to it, and the point was apparent. He didn't think that he would have enough bargaining leverage to get the Golan back if Egypt checked out of the process. So it was a very simple thing. He said, I have Syrian interests at heart here, and it's in my interest that there be a united front. And you remember when you came to office and we were talking about going to Geneva, the issue was, will there be a united Arab delegation or will there be separate national delegations? And Assad held out for the united Arab delegation because he was going to lose his leverage. But to Assad's credit, I remember his final statement in that conversation with Kissinger, which I thought was one of the most statesmanlike comments that I've ever heard. He said, as nearly as I can remember, I deeply disagree with what you tell me you are going to do, but I don't want it to affect our relationship with the United States.
Kissinger told me once that Assad was the most fascinating person he ever talked to.
Yeah. Just parenthetically, Assad was learning English on the side during that disengagement agreement, and Kissinger told him that he would be the only Arab leader who spoke English with a German accent.
Just to follow up very briefly, the statement that Hal just made, it hasn't been mentioned, but one of the major things as far as the Egyptians and much of the Arab world was concerned when you became President Carter, was shifting from the step-by-step approach that had characterized the previous administrations to comprehensivity. You made a statement to that effect very early, and this had remarkable impact. And as you will remember, the first 8 or 9 or 10 months of your first year in office, we were busy getting ready for a possible Geneva conference. Step by step, the meetings you had that you referred to, the agreement with the Soviets. And then, as I remember, when push came to shove, we were not getting an answer from Assad as to whether he was going to go even after you had accepted the idea of a unified Arab delegation, causing you to write that handwritten letter to Sadat, some bold step is needed. And Sadat then made the trip to Jerusalem, which shifted the thing again from comprehensivity to bilateral relationships.
I mentioned earlier that one of the things that Sadat attempted to do on comprehensiveness was his first proposal to me was to have all the members, the permanent members of the Security Council assembled in Cairo to pursue peace in the Mideast. And that's something that we didn't want to see done. And we went from there to the meeting. Rosen, you have a comment? It's time, just about time for lunch. Is that it? Okay. Well, we are still expecting a comment about video from Boutros Ghali in Egypt. I don't think it's come in yet. Is that correct? But it's still going to come. Osama, we're going to adjourn for lunch here. I guess you're going to be adjourning for supper or something. Would you like to make a final comment before we do adjourn?
Thank you, sir. I believe that this session has been most useful. Lots of statements were made that represented the truth, And I believe that we need the continuation of this kind of an involvement, this kind of a determined effort in order to change the present situation that exists in the region, because it's very precarious indeed.
Thank you. Well, I personally am gratified to know that you are still involved in the present situation, because I don't think anybody has a better grasp of the totality of the issues between Israel and the Palestinians and neighbors than do you. We're doubly grateful for your participation today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Matt, do you want to...